This project has been bouncing around the back of my mind since my junior year of high school when I took Mr. Starr's Intro to Woodworking class. Unfortunately, the first half of the class was extremely boring because it dealt with safety. The second half of the class, we had to come up with a project, get it approved, design it, and then finally build it. After I told him my idea of designing this large chessboard the size of a coffee table, he was reluctant to have me take on such a large project, but after a couple weeks of persuasion, I was finally able to get this approved. Over the next 2 weeks, we had to research, design, sketch out the project, and come up with a bill of materials. I still have all of the original paperwork that I used for this project. I went back to the website that I got one of my ideas from, which was shopsmith.com, typed in chess set, but unfortunately they did not have that design. I then went to a website called the Wayback Machine, where they keep previous copies of websites. I went back to January of 2005 and was able to navigate through the website and found the original source material that I used. This particular design, it was meant to be cut out on a scroll saw or a bandsaw, and I still even have the original templates I used for that project. The squares are 4 inches by 4 inches, but the pieces I made back in high school are only 2 inches by 2 inches. This past year, once I got my 3D printer, I decided to print up some large scale pieces. And then over the last 2 months, I made them out of solid copper. In order to make the molds that can withstand the copper, I'm going to make something called green sand. It is a mixture between regular sand and bentonite clay. I take the pool filter sand, run it through this screen to remove any of the larger chunks. Then I take fragrant-free kitty litter, put it in a blender, and chomp it down. Unfortunately, the blender does not powderize everything, so I'll also run it through the screen to remove any of the large chunks, and those will get reblended. During this project, I burned through 3 bags of bentonite clay, or kitty litter, and unfortunately I also destroyed a blender while I was at it. After I've got the sand and the powdered clay done, I then mix them together, add a little bit of water, and this final result is the green sand. Once I've got all of the green sand mixed up, I need to focus on the mold. Head over to the wood shop, cut some 2x4s, then I will also need to cut some specifically designed wedges that I will mount to the side of the board that will help each of the boxes interface with each other. I realize that wood probably isn't the best material to be making these boxes out of that will hold the liquid copper, but hopefully the sand will have enough insulating property and I don't spill too much on the wood, so hopefully this is not a problem. The shop that I'm working in used to be an ice cream factory, then it was a cheese factory, and a bunch of the old electrical is unusable, so that is where I will be getting my copper from. And a bunch of different people helped me run this wire through the wire strippers to remove the insulating jacket. Just like all of the rest of the projects, I've got no clue what I'm doing when it comes to this CAD software, so there was a rather steep learning curve figuring out how to take a 2D object and turning it into a 3D object. But with plenty of patience and searching internet forums, I was finally able to turn these into 3D objects. After getting the pawn design in the CAD software, I'll need to split it in half, send it over to the 3D printing software. The 3D printing software will then take those 3D models, slice them down layer by layer, convert that to G-code, then send it to the printer. And finally, after 3 weeks of prep work, I'm finally ready to make the first mold. In efforts to help the pawns not to stick to the sand, I'm going to be dousing them in a mixture of talcum powder and graphite. In order for the top half of the mold not to stick to the bottom half of the mold, I will be using talcum powder so that the sand does not stick together. Split the mold apart, remove the 3D printed pieces, carve in some pour lines, and put everything back together. And finally, at this point, I'm ready to start melting some copper. Get the crucible full, then head outside and get the furnace lit. After adding copper to the crucible multiple times, I finally have enough liquid copper to do the first pour. If my calculations are correct, I should have enough copper in here to pour all 4 pawns and still have 5 pounds left over. Unfortunately, the mold only took about half of the crucible, so I figured all of the pieces did not get poured. The next day when I took it out of the mold, that was confirmed as only 2 pieces turned out. To make things a little easier for myself next time, I will be putting this divider down the center, and I will be turning these 4 pawns into 2 pours each. As I'm working on this mold, I've already got the furnace outside lit and starting to melt some copper. Drug everything outside, got the crucible set up, then poured everything into the mold. As you can see, this one was much more successful than the first one. And I even had some visitors on this one where Paul and his kids stopped by for a few minutes. Later that night, I poured the other 2 pawns, and then waited till the next morning and drug the mold inside. And as you can see, between the weight of the copper and the weight of the mold, it came out to 117 pounds. But this time, all 4 pawns successfully turned out. I'm going to leave the pawns with a rougher look, so I'm not going to spend too much time sanding them, but I will need to remove the spur from the bottom of each of the pawns. If I didn't do that, they would not sit flat on the board. Once I have everything successfully taken care of on the first row, now I'm going to focus on the king and the queen. I'll bring them into the CAD software, cut them in half, install 2 holes that help me remove the molds from the sand, and then 2 spheres, concave on one side, convex on the other, which helps the 2 halves of the molds properly interface with each other. Create the G-code, send everything over to the printer, but unfortunately, sometime during that 9-hour print, either the freezer or the 3D printer tripped the arc fault breaker in the basement. Luckily enough, the 3D printer has a feature where you can resume a paused print. And as you can see, besides a few of the supports, everything turned out on the king. Because of the crown of the king, we had to splice it at a straight 90-degree angles. Because the queen did not have that same feature, we were able to cut it at a 45-degree angle, which will be a whole lot easier once we go to make the molds. The king and the queen are going to be the heaviest pieces I pour, and I'm kind of excited to see how they turn out. Because of the weight, I'm going to use this 2-wheel cart to take it outside, and I was able to pour the king without any issues besides a little bit of splattering. Melt a bunch more copper in the crucible, come back about 45 minutes later and attempt to pour the queen. I'm not 100% sure why, but about halfway through pouring the queen, because of the weight of the copper, the mold split apart right here and kind of started the mold and the 2-wheel cart on fire. I figured there would be a steep learning curve, so I'm not super upset that this happened, just one more thing to learn from. The next morning, after we've given the mold plenty of time to cool off, we drag it inside, and I've got no complaints with how the king turned out. Unfortunately, I can't say the same thing about the queen. Because of the mold splitting apart, it's about a 1/4 inch thicker, and so I'm going to need to melt this down and try again. Because I was using a talcum powder graphite mix, we had quite a bit of sand stick to the copper. And because of that, that required quite a bit of TLC with the grinder to get that sand removed. Once I'm done with that rough grinding, I'm going to be using a sanding pad with 36, 50, 80, 120, and 180 grits. With the failure of the queen, I'm going to need to make up another mold and test my luck again. I also need to pour in an additional 2 pawns. Unfortunately, this night it was a little bit cooler, and I also had some issues getting the crucible out, which allowed a slight piece of metal on the top to cool down, and as soon as I poured that into the queen, it immediately blocked the channel that it would go into the queen. Immediately, I realized what the issue was, and I realized I had plenty of metal left in the crucible in order to pour those 2 pawns. Once it's cooled off and I drag it inside, there's no surprise that the queen failed, but both of the pawns turned out just like they're supposed to. Not having any success on those first 2 queens, I make up a 3rd mold, and besides spilling a little extra, this one turned out perfectly. And it's at this point I seriously regret using wood for the mold that will hold liquid copper. Let it cool off, drag it inside, and start to take it out of the mold. As you can see, we've got a little bit of slippage on the side, but compared to the last 2, this one will work just fine. And just like with welding, grinding will fix quite a bit of issues. Chuck it up in the bench vise, then go to work removing all of the sand that has been attached to the copper. Because of the heat of the copper in the mold, it dries out all of this sand. At this point, I got tired of mixing everything by hand, so I went and got this really small cement mixer and started to mix the green sand in there. The sand wasn't quite as good as if you mixed it by hand, but it took about 1/10 of the time, so I'm not going to complain. At this point in the project, I'm starting to run out of copper that I've prepared, so I head over to the wood shop and start to make these little bundles of copper. All of this wire comes out to 31.5 pounds, and just the king and the queen by themselves come out to 28.5 pounds. The next piece I'm going to be working on is going to be the bishop. Just like the queen, I'm able to do this one at a 45-degree angle, get it sliced, get all the index marks put in, and get it printed off. Somewhere during this process, I got tired of lifting that larger mold, so I decided to make this smaller mold to save my back. This time, when I set everything up outside, I accidentally had the camera in slow motion, which actually turned out to be pretty cool. Even though that pour looked really cool, it did not fully fill the mold, so I'm going to head back inside, make another mold, and then take this copper piece and add it to the crucible. Using most of the same copper from the first previous fail, we get everything in the crucible, and this one was a complete success. Next, we'll head over to the CAD software and get the knight cut in half. Because of the orientation of the knight, we're not able to slice it at a 45-degree angle, so we'll have to do it at a 90 and get that thing printed off. As I make a mold for the first knight, I am also going to be making the mold for the second bishop. Since the knight is going to take more copper than the bishop, I'm going to pour that one first. And besides spilling a little bit, everything turned out just fine. Since the furnace is up to temperature and the mold's already made, I'm going to add a little bit more copper to the crucible and also get this knight poured tonight. As soon as I start to pour the knight, as you can see, it starts to pour out of the side. I'm hoping this isn't the main issue and it'll hopefully clog up soon, but unfortunately that was not the case, and I poured quite a bit of this copper basically just straight onto the ground. Because of all that excess heat outside of the mold, it started part of the mold on fire, but as soon as I got that copper away, I was able to get the fire extinguished. Luckily enough, the next time I poured the knight, we had a successful pour. I saved the most difficult piece for last, which is going to be the rook. I can't cut it at a 45-degree angle, I can't cut it at a 90-degree angle because of the crown. To get around this issue, I'm going to place a hexagon on the top portion of the rook, then split it at a 45-degree angle, add in the finger holes and the concave and convex index marks, then send it off to the 3D printer. I then separate the base of the rook from that hexagon, draw a cube around the hexagon, then remove the hexagon from the cube shape. I then need to add back the crown portion of the rook. In order to make sure the head of the rook goes back to the same exact spot, I'm going to put in this bar on the backside, which will interface with the outside of the cube. Just like every other part of the project, I'm going to need to add these spheres for indexing on the cube shape. Take one final look at everything to make sure it'll work like it's supposed to. I then send everything over to the 3D printing software, get everything mocked up and sent to the printer. I didn't have enough filament left on the spool to print all 5 pieces, so I printed this top piece, switched the roll, then switched over to the base of the rook. And besides a few of the supports that didn't properly adhere, everything turned out just fine on the rook. For that special mold that goes on the top portion of the rook, I will be using a little bit different method. I measure out 161 grams of sand. I will need to add 5% of the weight of this sodium silicate, which is commonly known as water glass. If you ever work with this stuff, be extremely careful. It falls somewhere between 10 and 13 on the pH scale. Continue to get everything mixed up, then I will need to focus on getting the CO2 tank ready. Knowing that this project was coming up, I picked up this 20-pound bottle of CO2. I fully realized with this project I could have got away with a pound or two of dry ice, but I'm going to be using this CO2 tank for some future projects. Once I got the hose attached, I also connect a barbed fitting, which helps inject the CO2 into the piece. Once everything's ready to go with the CO2 tank, I start to fill the mold with this water glass sand. Once I've got all of the sand added to the mold and everything properly packed down, I introduce CO2 gas in there, which reacts with the sodium silicate and turns everything rock hard. Once the CO2 hardens up the sodium silicate, I go to take it out of the mold. But due to poor design, and this being the first one, the first core broke. I had planned for a failure and actually made up enough sand to pour 3 of these. Once this next core has hardened up, I go to take it out of the mold, still not 100% sure how I'm going to remove the core part. I then rotate the core 90 degrees in the mold, constantly pick it up and drop it, which helps extract the head of the Rook from the base of the sand. It's maybe not the perfect design, but I was able to get core number 2 and core number 3 extracted with no issues. Once I've got the 2 cores made, I need to focus on making the base portion of the mold. This is just like all of the other molds that I've made so far. But because of the hexagon portion I put on the top of the Rook, I'm able to slide this core directly into the mold. I do need to be extremely careful when I put the top portion of the mold on, that the top portion properly interfaces in with that core. For tonight's pour, I'm going to be doing 2 Rooks and 1 Knight. It takes somewhere between an hour and 45 minutes and 2 hours for the furnace to get up to temperature for the first pour, and about 45 minutes to an hour to melt enough copper to do the second and third pours. I'm able to get that first Rook poured with no issues. Because I'm reusing a bunch of previously used copper that has some sand attached to it, I need to scrape off any of the impurities that have floated to the top. And it's at this time the Knight pours with no issues. Add more copper to the pot, then come back about 45 minutes later to pour the final Rook. I'm still fairly new to the whole pouring liquid copper thing, but this one turned out way better than the first one I did. And with this project, there were definitely a few nights where I was up well past midnight. With as many pieces that have failed so far, I was worried that the Rooks would not turn out properly. Both the first and the second Rook turned out without any issues. My only complaint so far is it looked like that sodium silicate sand bonded to the copper a little bit differently, and it was much harder to grind through. I removed as much of that sand as I could with the pressure washer, then took it inside and put it on the bench vise and ground it. And in total, King, Queen, 2 Rooks, 2 Pawns, 2 Knight came out to 95.72 pounds, and all of the pawns came in at 45 pounds. And it's at this point I spent way too much time on these pieces with the grinder. I started with the large grinder, then switched to the smaller grinder, then switched to a 36, 50, 80, 120, and 180 grit sandpaper. I spent a little bit more time and attention on the King and the Queen since they're the main pieces. I did also use a buffing compound and a buffing wheel, but this turned out to be kind of pointless. And after this project kicking around in my mind for over a decade, I was finally able to make it a reality. I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to do for the other side, but at this point I'm contemplating using cast aluminum. And if you're wondering how tall the King is, it's over twice as tall as a regular soda can.